Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. Every week, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors to help us go quickly and deeply into issues that are shaping the business and policy landscape. I'm Luiza Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, which is a new kind of media that's built for executives and policymakers who need insights to help them see around the corners of policy and industry trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports that include actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and of course, healthcare. We also have a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and live briefings where we sort out developments that are changing the business and policy landscape. And today, we're looking at some of the most important changes at the Food and Drug Administration that are going to affect how medicines, medical devices, and vaccines are reviewed and approved. These changes have implications for both patients and for industry. In some cases, the FDA will require more evidence before approving a treatment, and in other cases, they're simplifying and speeding up the approval process. These changes have not been without controversy, so we're going to unpack what these changes do and don't do with two expert guests. Rebecca Adams is our lead healthcare analyst, and she's recently published a deeply reported analysis report on this topic. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Luiza.
And our special guest today is Dr. Robert Califf. He served as the 25th Commissioner of Food and Drugs from 2016 to 2017, nominated by President Barack Obama, and again from 2022 to 25, nominated by President Joe Biden. He's also a cardiologist and an adjunct professor of medicine in the Division of Cardiology at the Duke University School of Medicine. Thank you for being here, Dr. Califf.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And so here's how we'll organize our discussion of this really complex topic for the next hour. First, we'll talk about the FDA's plans for accelerated reviews. Then we'll talk about how changes to how vaccines are reviewed and the changes to the vaccine schedule are playing out. And third, we'll discuss some major staff changes happening at the FDA and the impact that they could have on the operations of that agency. And as always, we'll discuss how business leaders and policymakers should be navigating this moment. And I'd like to thank our audience for the questions you sent in ahead of the briefing. We will definitely get to some of those. And throughout the conversation, I invite you to drop your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. And we'll also reserve some time if we have a lot of questions come in. So let's jump right in. Rebecca, let's start with the report that you published on WP Intelligence, the FDA's Big Shift. You wrote that the FDA is embarking on a dramatic shift in how it reviews some products, including vaccines and drugs, and that this is creating an uneven regulatory landscape with some products being fast-tracked and others, including vaccines, facing more scrutiny and higher standards. So let's start with the new initiative that seeks to compress these review timelines, an approach that one of the agency officials you talked to called ultra-accelerated reviews. How long does an FDA review normally take, and how does this accelerated review work?
Well, thank you, Luiza, and thank you to Dr. Califf for joining us. I do want to note that we invited the FDA, and hopefully they'll be able to join us for a future briefing. So normally FDA reviews take about 10 to 12 months. There are other reviews that are faster. There are about 4 different programs at the FDA in which the action is a little bit faster than that, usually around 6 months. So 1 to 2 months is very quick.
So how are they going to do it so quickly? What is the change that they're making to compress something that much?
Sure. So FDA Commissioner Marty Makary says that what they're doing is getting rid of the downtime, that they are working in a team-based approach so that they're all together focusing on a particular product. One thing that's kind of interesting, though, is that already we've seen 4 of the drugs that were chosen, they have been facing delays. So it is a challenge.
Dr. Califf, can you talk about your take on this new accelerated process? What do you see as the potential pros and cons of this new way of accelerating reviews?
Well, I feel like at the start, I always need to give a brief introduction to the frame that I come from. I have been a political appointee twice, so avoiding politics is not something I can do. I'm 74 years old. I'm not looking for an NIH grant or a job. So I feel like I'm pretty free to give my opinions, but I also recognize I could be wrong about a lot of this. So welcome other points of view. What I would say is, of course, reviews have always been uneven. But the difference is in the past, the reason for unevenness of reviews has been diligently displayed publicly, discussed, and often written into law. Rebecca mentioned that actually over half of approved products now on the drug side go through an accelerated pathway, which takes about 6 months on average. But the rationale for that is this is intended for for serious diseases that have a predictable negative outcome where there is no effective treatment. And so this, real renaissance of treatments for rare disease, have been tailor-made for the accelerated pathways, which are actually written into the law in a process that takes a while, including a lot of public input to derive the method. What's being done here seems a lot more arbitrary, so it's really hard to understand exactly what the effect is going to be. The second point I would make is that the time from the application to approval or lack of approval, I still bristle a little bit at the term approval process because you got to remember that 90% of drugs that get into clinical trials never make it to the market because they either cause a toxicity or are ineffective in pre approval testing. And the companies don't submit applications in, they just withdraw the product from development. So I prefer to call it the evaluation process rather than the approval process. But 90% or 95% of that time is in all the studies that happen between phase one, when a drug first goes into human beings, and the final phase 3 trial. So speeding up this last part actually has a pretty small effect on the total time it takes to get a product from thinking that it might be something useful to getting it onto the market.
Rebecca, is this process going to change how the clinical trials themselves unfold, how many people are tested and for how long? I mean, what are the actual practical changes that have to take place to get such a compressed timeline?
Well, this would be actually just the consideration, the FDA's consideration, although there are other things happening at the FDA that could affect that. Commissioner McCary has talked about relying on one clinical trial rather than two, which is something that the agency already has moved forward on in other circumstances, but he really wants to rely on that quite a bit, but we're still waiting for details on that. So it's interesting. I do want to build a little bit on Dr. Califf's point about the fact that drug companies put so much money for so many years into developing these products that the difference between a 1 to 2 month review process and a 6-month review process is not as much as something that would affect the clinical trial development.
Yeah, Rebecca, I'd also comment, you made a comment about working in teams. That is the way drugs have been approved for decades. The issue is that it's a big team with a lot of things that have to be considered. Very often, the holdup is the manufacturing process. And it doesn't help a whole lot to show the drug is effective in a clinical trial if you botch the manufacturing and make an unsafe product in the end. So the difference between manufacturing for a clinical trial and manufacturing for global distribution in a safe way is quite different. And I think, so there's so many things that go into that final step. It is very much an orchestrated teamwork effort. If it can be speeded up and done as well, I'm all for it. But I think it's going to be hard to do.
Rebecca, how is the FDA choosing which companies are being picked to participate in this program, and how many have participated so far?
So far there are 18 different products that have been chosen, and It's interesting because they did not go through the full process of laying out all the details. They put some information on a website, and people would love to have more details. Right now, people can submit their interest and go to the website and let the FDA know that they are interested. But previously, in the first batch in October of 9 different drugs, some of the companies were completely floored and surprised that they were considered. They hadn't asked for this, and a couple of them weren't ready. So the criteria is, there are different things that the commissioner is looking for. One of them is addressing a U.S. public health crisis. Another is a large unmet medical need. But it's also interesting that some of the criteria that they're looking for, and each product doesn't have to meet all of the criteria, but it has to meet one of the criteria at least. But some of the things are more political and policy oriented than we've seen from FDA in the past. One is affordability, for example, the affordability of a drug. Another one is onshoring of manufacturing. So those are things we haven't really seen FDA discuss in terms of reviews or accelerating reviews before.
That's very interesting. Dr. Califf, is there anything that companies should be wary of here if your drug goes through an accelerated review process? I mean, does that affect maybe confidence or trust in that drug at the end of the day?
Well, once it's chosen, large companies that have adequate staff will be diligent to make sure the review is good, because the last thing you want as a company is to get your product on the market and then, like I say, have something wrong with manufacturing or something comes to light that really was a mistake in the way the label was written or the many things that have to be done. So smaller companies that get chosen are going to need to be diligent about that. But I also just want to emphasize that the method of choosing, throughout the history of the FDA, if there was a product that looked like it was going to really make a big difference for public health at the level of the relevant center, like drugs, biologics, or devices, there would be an extra effort put in because, of course, the people that work at FDA are vitally aware of the public health and what the impact might be. But I will say, one thing I do like is choosing products based on effects on chronic disease. Is something that I think has gotten a short shrift. A long time ago, believe it or not, there was a time when no one was making cancer drugs because they were not profitable. So a number of measures were put into place to help cancer. Something I'm thinking about a lot today because we're having to get together for Rick Passer, who's just leaving the FDA after a long career of leading the cancer effort. And then we realized that rare diseases were, it was hard to make the case for the market for rare disease. So we put in incentives there that have had a big effect in both those cases. But the common chronic diseases that are leading to the greatest death and disability in our country have not gotten the same attention. And so, I say that as a cardiologist who's, the leading cause of death is heart disease. So I'm glad to see that get a priority. But when the process is political, of course, there's a lot to be concerned about. Uh, Most of us former commissioners have felt that the commissioner, being a political appointee, should leave the prioritization to the civil servants who don't have a conflict of interest. And a lot of our job has been to protect the civil service from political influences. It's almost every day that I would get a call from someone who had influenced a politician, a lobbyist typically, wanting a priority of some kind. And sometimes there's good reason for it, but a lot of times it's just currying favor. So it's got to be something to keep an eye on. And, hopefully it will be done in the best possible way.
Rebecca, you had a chart in your report showing how many drugs typically get approval each year. Can you tell us more about the pace of these approvals and how it varies or doesn't vary, or what drives it?
So it was interesting last year because of the churn, because there were so many departures, because of a variety of different factors. The FDA was not moving quite as quickly earlier in the year as it has been in the past, and some people were expecting a lower than usual year of approvals last year. But it was kind of interesting. The FDA at the end of the year stepped up and they approved 5 new drugs in November and 7 drugs in December. So if you look at 2025's total, it's just slightly under what 2024 was.
That's really interesting. And can you talk a little bit more, Rebecca, about the Commissioner's Voucher Program and some of the challenges to it?
Well, I think there are a lot of different challenges. I actually would be very interested in hearing Dr. Califf talk a little bit more about this, because I think that there were some lobbyists who said, you know, if my drug company has great evidence, I'm not sure I want to be selected for this ultra accelerated review because it hasn't gone through Congress. It's not in statute. And there might be some challenges to it legally. And maybe you want to go ahead and go through an accelerated review of 6 months rather than take some chances with this other one that is not quite as perhaps on legal ground. But I would love to hear what Dr. Califf thinks about that.
You know, I'm not so worried about that. Once a drug is on the market or a device, it's pretty hard to take it back. So, but again, it gets to the point I was making before. Usually in policy, there's a period where you put out the policy, there's public comment, it goes through entire process, often being written into law. And when that's not done, eventually down the road, it could pretty easily be rescinded because there's not an administrative record. But I think the countervening factor here is, frankly, people are afraid to sue in situations where they otherwise would, because the Trump factor is not trivial here in terms of how companies view their relationship with government agencies. So one sort of rationalizing factor in the whole system has been if one company gets an unfair advantage from the FDA, other companies would sue. I don't think you're going to see a lot of that in this administration for the reason that I gave. So as a company, I wouldn't worry so much about it now, but I would worry about it for the system as a whole, because our whole process of developing effective treatments is dependent on a view that it's fair and that there's a rationale and a scientific basis that's carefully considered. Remembering that the investment is really a 10 or 15 year investment. It's not a 9-month investment or a 2-month investment just to get the product approved. And most of the money is spent, you know, in very difficult clinical trials to try to sort out what a drug can actually do. And most of our blockbusters were not initially developed for the reason they ended up being blockbusters. Just look at GLP-1s as an example. They were developed as drugs for diabetes, and they're having these enormous effects in places no one expected.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I think one of the themes of your report, Rebecca, was, you know, just the sheer variability that's being introduced into the system by both the accelerated process on the one hand, and then some of the more slowed down process for vaccines. So I want to turn to that for a few minutes. You wrote that this is quite a seismic departure from precedent in the administration's decision to limit how the public gets access to vaccines through changes to both the immunization schedule and then this more time-consuming approval process. So can you just walk us through what the biggest developments have been related to vaccine and sort of where we are now?
Sure, there's been so much. I mean, where to start? So as we know, HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy, before coming to government, was an anti-vaccine activist. And so one of the first things he did was in June, he replaced the CDC Advisory Committee and put his own hand-selected folks on that committee. These are the folks who make recommendations to CDC about what vaccines should be recommended. And since then, there have been a lot of changes. There have been changes to, they removed thimerosal from the flu vaccine. They made changes to the recommendations for COVID, and they prioritize people over 65 and people who are at risk for that. They made changes to the childhood vaccine schedule. This is all CDC related. The childhood vaccine schedule changes, those were pretty significant. They no longer have 17 recommended vaccines. Now it's 11. And so that's on the CDC side. With the FDA, we have not seen things actually be implemented, but we have seen a lot proposed, and internally at least. So Dr. Rene Broussard, who has multiple roles at the FDA right now, he has expressed concerns about vaccines. He has talked about how vaccines should go through randomized clinical trials. He has talked about, if you're creating a pneumonia vaccine, it's not enough to just show antibodies. You need to be able to show, at least in post-marketing, that it reduced pneumonia. He said that he would not approve marketing authorization for pregnant women to get vaccines. So, and one of the things that really stood out to me is changing the annual flu framework. So, the flu vaccine is updated on a regular basis. So he wants to take a much different approach, and we'll see if that actually comes to fruition or not.
And when would that happen? When would his proposals
be this is what we're watching for. So this was part of an email that he sent to the staff, and we have not seen the regulatory process move forward. We haven't seen guidance come out on that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Califf, there was a remarkable letter that came out from 12 former FDA commissioners, both Republicans and Democrats, that criticized Prasad's plan, and you were one of the former FDA commissioners who signed the letter. I'm curious, tell us about how this letter came together and why you decided to speak out the way you did.
Well, it's pretty well known that once you've been in the seat of FDA commissioner, you develop a bond with others that have been in that position. It's really a hot seat where every day you're going to get criticized for something, but you're also going to encounter something that you never would have expected. Like, I was not an infant formula expert, and my first day in 2022 was the day the Abbott recall occurred. So there's sort of a support group of former commissioners who talk frequently and try to support the FDA as much as they possibly can. And in this case, literally, when all of this sort of came out, we had a call, and within 24 hours, we had reached agreement. It's all the living former commissioners and acting commissioners, except for one, had complete agreement within 24 hours, submitted the manuscript, and it was accepted also within 24 hours to come out. And it's really a big concern about the process here. And I think Rebecca did a good job. First of all, thanks for identifying RFK Jr. as an anti-vaccine activist, not a vaccine skeptic. Those to me are not the same thing. But secondly, normally if you're going to change something major like this at the FDA, you write at least a guidance. The guidance, because this would be a major change, would have a period of public comment and also input from the industry and from patient and public health groups that are concerned, and then it would be finalized. In this case, we're getting policy by journal article or YouTube or a Fox News pronouncement. And it's very hard to know when it might be implemented, who would implement it. At a time when 20% of the workforce is gone, are there even going to be people to follow through with what's being said? So, we went through all these issues as a group and just, hope that there will be some return to process that enables rational policy to be developed. And, of course, many of us are worried about the vaccine situation in the U.S. My read of it is that there's a very active effort to make it difficult for people to get vaccinated. And yet, most of us believe, based on the data, that vaccination is one of the most amazing advances in medicine that has kept our children. In my case, I'm a great grandparent now. I really care about my grandchildren and great grandchildren being protected from infectious diseases that we thought we'd never see again.
Mm-hmm. And I would invite the audience to send in any questions you have so that we might have time to address them. What was the reaction, Dr. Califf, from the agency when you published this joint letter?
Well, I mean, the FDA is like Duke University, where I, have worked most of my career. It's a big place with a lot of different people. If you say, what's the reaction from the leadership? Really not much, because, we just are living in two different information ecosystems right now. So there's, I think the leadership at FDA now is proceeding along, as best I can tell, led by RFK, who, remember, showed up on his almost on his first day. He went to FDA and called the full-time civil servants sock puppets of industry, which sort of tells you something about his attitude about listening to the past functions of FDA. I did want to just add, most of my career has been spent doing large clinical trials in cardiovascular disease. I'm all for developing broader evidence from larger clinical trials, but it doesn't necessarily have to delay vital vaccines, particularly where we have a history of knowing the effectiveness of the vaccines.
Mm-hmm. What was the reaction of industry to these announcements of the higher evidentiary standards, slower timelines, and just the overall more skeptical environment?
Well, I have to say, I think the industry has been cowered by the current administration. So you look at the investments that were going into vaccines across the industry, and particularly, we haven't talked about messenger RNA yet. It's been vast, but it's been cut back, and the industry is sort of biding its time and laying low about the situation. And of course, the worry that many of us have is that the combination of all the efforts to make it difficult to manufacture and administer vaccines are going to lead to a situation where people really are at major risk over time, because basically you have an industry that, if it can't make a profit of some kind, who would want to run a company where you're making a product that you can't possibly make a profit on? And particularly the issue of autism and vaccines, and the potential that changes there could lead to liability, just raises a huge specter. But basically, industry, what would be the advantage to a company of speaking up about this? It wouldn't go over well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the only industry. I would say the news industry's had similar issues.
And Rebecca, explain where we are now regarding consumer access to vaccines. Can you still get all the vaccines as an individual person, or are there difficulties in accessing some?
Well, it sort of varies. Your mileage may vary. So a lot of it depends on where you live and where you get your vaccines. Some of these that were changed, they were changed to shared decision making. So the idea that you need to go and talk to your doctor before getting a vaccine. But a lot of states have actually moved in the opposite direction to try to protect access to vaccines too. So I find it all really interesting. I wanted to ask Dr. Califf, what are you, in terms of future joint action? It's interesting to me that you've got this support group of former FDA commissioners who talk to each other and try to support the current administration, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of communication during this administration that way. And I'm wondering whether the former commissioners are looking ahead to future action with concern.
Yes. I mean, this is an outlier administration, but, if you read Project 2025, it was designed as an outlier administration, and the FDA is just part of that overall effort. So you might imagine there's a lot of communication with people that work at the FDA, but not a lot of communication with the current leadership. And, all of us think that's unfortunate that we would have something to contribute, even if there were fundamental differences. I mean, after all us former commissioners represent Democrat and Republican political appointments over the span of decades. So there is a lot of experience that could be brought to bear. But, the big concern, as I say, is really that this is a precursor to creating a set of conditions that would make it very, very risky for companies to manufacture and give vaccines.
You say a precursor. What kind of future developments on vaccines are you still anticipating? And do you think there will be changes to the framework for the annual flu vaccine, for example?
Well, um, if the policies get implemented that were brought forward, it would be very difficult to develop an annual flu vaccine because you'd have to do large randomized trials, which again, I'm totally in favor of, but those can be done post-market and there can be clever means to do them. But if you hold up a vaccine for a large trial, you won't be able to adapt a vaccine to the current configuration. Remember that the virus is looked at basically what happens in other parts of the world that are on the opposite seasons from the US leads to the configuration of a new vaccine for flu every year that's meant to be adapted to the prevalent strain, which is creating clinical illness. So it'd be very hard to do that. We're really talking about technical issues there. I think there's a much bigger issue related to liability. Remember that there's a Congress, because there was a time when no one would make a vaccine of any kind because of liability. Congress enacted a vaccine injury compensation system, which is imperfect, but has enabled people to make vaccines without fear they'll go out of business from liability. And now, that's being called into question on several fronts, particularly, as I say, the autism thing, which keeps coming up, even though it's pretty hard to support there's any relationship between vaccines and autism.
There's a question from the audience. Do you foresee companies developing drugs for markets outside the US and just ignoring the US market, or is the US market too large to make drugs viable without us?
Well, I'd say there will be a lot of brain power put into trying to see if that can be done. If you combine Europe, ASEAN countries, and China, that's a pretty big market. But because of the fact that we pay more for drugs than anyone else, it's made it almost impossible to develop the intensive capital needed for drug development unless you involve the US market. But that's also changing. And, let me just say I'm in favor for innovator drugs. We've been paying too much in the US relative to other countries. But as we bring that back into parity with other countries, the reasons to pay attention to the US market go down. So I would say it's an unknown. It would be hard right now to develop products and not include the US because that's where most of the money is made currently. But that could change. And certainly China intends for that to change.
There's another audience question asking, as a public citizen, how do you deal with the changes of the FDA regulations? And I assume they're talking about vaccines.
Well, it's not the only place. And there's really not a whole lot that you can do as an individual citizen other than vote. um, and as I say, a lot of the mechanisms that have been in play before that involve the legal system, I think people are really afraid to take that on because of concerns about retribution. Like if you were successful suing HHS in some way, would you get selected as a priority drug?
Well, what about
People don't.
navigating the sort of mixed information that consumers now are receiving? When should they get
Oh, you're
vaccines? Should they get vaccines? Like, how can, if you're a parent or an individual, where do you go to make sense of all this if you fear that maybe some of the information you're getting is politicized?
some. Well, this is abundantly clear to me. The professional societies representing the doctors who care for patients with all these different kinds of problems where vaccines are effective have banded together, created their own guidelines, led by the pediatricians and the Society for Infectious Diseases. And that's the place to go. And that's what medical professionals, the vast majority, are going to look at. It's publicly available. You can find it. You can find the guidelines on the web, and your doctor. Um, in many cases now in the U.S., it might be a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant who's providing the primary care or a public health clinic. They should be fully aware of what those guidelines say. Rebecca sort of alluded to when she said it's possible that you could get all the vaccines now, but it's a lot harder than it was. And like a lot of things in the U.S., if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of education, you can navigate the system pretty effectively. But it's going to be more difficult for people without wealth and um, higher education to figure out how to navigate the system.
Well, Rebecca, let's talk about one other issue at the FDA that you highlighted in your report. You talked about major staff departures that could have far-reaching consequences both for industry and for public health. Talk a little bit about how big are these departures and what's behind them?
So what we know is that in the first half of 2025, at least according to Capitol Hill staff, there were 4,100 departures, and that's through probationary firings, the RIFs, the early retirements, and so forth. But we have a little bit more extended data on two different centers at the FDA, the Biologics Center and the Drug Evaluation and Research Center, that we have data through September 30th on those two centers. And you can see that there are significant changes in 2023 and in 2024. There was slight growth in the workforce for both of those centers. And then in 2025, there were tremendous changes. In the CEDAR, in the Drug Center, there were about 1,100 departures during that time. And in the Biologics Center, there were about 224 departures.
Well, that's pretty dramatic. Dr. Califf, you've run this agency, you know it from the inside out. What impact would you expect that kind of staff exodus to have on the agency's ability to operate?
Well, there are a couple of critical points I'd like to try to make. And again, I recognize I have opinions. They may not be entirely correct, but at least it's my point of view. First of all, I do want to say that when we had our first meeting of agency heads in 2022 together, and people were asked, what's the number one thing holding back your agency? 100% of the agency heads, I'm talking about NIH, CDC, CMS, said it was the personnel policies that were holding things back. And, it's well known that there are problems with typical government personnel policies as it relates to science agencies. So we should acknowledge that some change is not a bad thing necessarily. But then it gets difficult. Reducing the size by 20% will have an effect in a place you wouldn't necessarily think about it, because it's understandable that the press tends to focus on those applications that go in that are publicly available and the decisions that are made about them. But as I've already said, 90% of the work is occurring over a decade of clinical trials where meetings with the FDA with knowledgeable experts are absolutely critical. Something you wouldn't normally think about. Let's say you're a company and you're making a new drug for a new biological target, and almost always when you start doing your first clinical trials, surprising things happen. The people who work at FDA get to see all the other companies that are making drugs for that target and what's happening with them. But that information is a trade secret. That is a proprietary information of the companies. Now, the FDA can't tell you which company did what, but they could say, you know, you might look at excluding these patients because there might be a risk, or think about this drug interaction. That is enormously valuable to companies as they navigate the system, whereas I've already said the best drugs typically don't work for the things they were initially invented for, but work for something else. So losing not only 20% of the workforce, but a very high proportion of people with a lot of experience, having seen all the things that happen, it has an impact way in early drug development that doesn't show up in the statistics that you're talking about. And that's a big concern. And I think in any organization, if your boss said you were a sock puppet of some other industry, I don't know how you would feel about working in that organization. And so, you know, I don't think that the exodus of people is over yet.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Califf, what do you make of the fact that there were 5 different directors for the drug center over the past year?
I think it's the same thing. Again, some of this just goes all the way back to Project 2025. If you believe that federal agencies are corrupt and full of people who are lazy and not doing their jobs and need to be fired, then it would be hard to think you could have a leader of the biggest part of an agency like the FDA who was a part of the history. If you believe that civil servants are dedicated to the public health, which I lived with them every day for 7 years, and I've been in every other part of the industry, mostly healthcare delivery as a doctor, but also leadership of health systems. I worked at Google for 6 years. I've seen the private sector in every shape and form, and I would put the federal worker, at least at the FDA, up against any of them. So the turnover, I think, was expected. As I said, we're celebrating Dr. Pazder this afternoon off campus, you know, who really led the change in cancer drugs for several decades. But, you know, he lasted less than a month, just because there's a view that the past is not the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, you mentioned a number of other changes at the FDA, including bypassing the normal process of releasing draft documents for the public to comment on before policies are finalized, and walking away from traditions set out in federal law about listening to recommendations of an advisory committee of outside experts. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening there and the potential impact here on the pharmaceutical and device industry?
Yes, it's been really interesting that they have walked away from holding advisory committee meetings near the end of the year. And it's interesting that they're not putting out a lot of the policies through formal guidance where you do collect the comments and you come back and finalize it. And the FDA is not a particularly fast-moving agency in terms of regulations regularly when you compare it to some of the other agencies. So it has been a big change. It has potentially put the agency in a more vulnerable position because it is helpful to establish that legal record of having gone through that process. So it is a different sort of position than we've seen the FDA in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Califf, in all our briefings, we like to give recommendations to leaders for how to navigate some of these changes that we're talking about. I'm wondering what advice you would have for people in this industry who have to work with the FDA as part of their job, part of trying to make new drugs, get things approved, improve current devices, et cetera. How should they be approaching this moment?
Well, I think a lot of conversations with Congress and with the current leadership of FDA and HHS about the importance of an even, fair system. And, you were talking about guidances, and I think this is a difference at FDA compared to a lot of other federal agencies. If you talk to the drug and device industry folks, they like guidances. And in many other agencies, the industries that are regulated hate guidances and federal regulations, but the whole industry resonates to the compilation of evidence and procedures that are in FDA guidances. So doing it right, and you mentioned the advisory committees, which basically are largely defunct now, but there's a reason that there's a public process for vetting advisory committee members for conflicts and airing issues to the public. And I hope that that will pick up. But to industry leaders, this is a long game, and I think everybody who's really involved in the industry knows this. And so it's a matter of gentle persuasion through conversations to try to keep things as even keeled as possible and applauding the changes that are beneficial, like don't eat ultra processed food. That's a good one. I'm glad that has become a big deal.
Mhm.
But I don't see any, way to just change things dramatically. It's on a course and it'll have to play out.
We also had an audience question asking, what advice would you give to the biotech sector to weather these changes?
That's a really interesting one. And I've always been involved in the biotech sector as a clinician developing, my career was made developing treatments for heart attack and heart failure. And without, the new drugs, we would have not had all the success that we've had. But right now, it's an interesting time because the biology is just amazing what can be done and the biological targets, the potential for messenger RNA, for example, to an siRNA to have a major impact on health outcomes for various diseases. And, biotech leaders are not stupid. And, what's happening, as you well know, is a move to China. And a very large proportion now of new products are being invented in China, which is something that many of us thought would take a lot longer to happen. And so, the biotech sector needs to work as closely as it can with the current HHS and FDA leadership and push hard to come up with sensible regulations that facilitate development, but as I say, also keep it fair and scientifically based.
Dr. Califf, thank you, could you say a little bit more about the threat of China?
Well, I mean, in my career, I had the privilege of helping start a university in China, and I've done a lot of work there. And I would just say it's a mix of opportunity and threat. There's no question that the Chinese government wants to be dominant in the pharmaceutical and biotech and medical device sectors. They're putting huge amounts of money and energy into it. They're recruiting the best scientists from the U.S. that they can. Remembering that many of our best scientists came from China because of the opportunity in the U.S., but an increasing number are going back. And they've developed a system of medical product development that moves things much more quickly through the system to the point where it can be then evaluated in the more rigorous clinical trials that we do in the U.S. So one area where I hope there'll be a lot of joint activity is the phase 1 effort. And when people say, well, why don't we just do phase 1? It looks pretty simple. Remember, you're putting a new molecule in a human being for the first time. And we could have a lot of discussions about the ethics of that in a country like China and how that's done. So speed is one component, but we also have human rights that need to be considered. But we already showed with cardiovascular devices in my specialty that you could move the industry back to the U.S. for early phase development if you put the right elements together. But the opportunity, you're talking about 1.5 billion people with an economy that's growing rapidly in China, there's an opportunity for U.S. products there if we can, so much of this depends on the larger geopolitical environment. And, our advice in the last year of the Biden administration was, if you're going to work in China, you got to be ready to pull your stuff out in one day. Because we don't know what might happen with things like Taiwan that need to be considered. But, having worked in China a lot, Chinese people are, they're human beings just like us, and they would like to have drugs that work and live longer and better lives. So that's an amazing opportunity if we can figure it out.
That's fascinating. Rebecca, talk about some of the recommendations you had in your report also.
Sure. One thing to keep an eye on going forward is that we are in the middle of user fee talks. So these are negotiations that happen because legislation expires and the user fees have to be reauthorized by Congress. So those talks are ongoing. They're closed door communications between the industry and the agency, and then there are stakeholder meetings as well. So that will eventually come to Congress, and lawmakers will be able to have their say there, and that's certainly something to watch.
And you expect these issues to come up during those hearings?
I certainly think that there will be questions asked.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in our briefings, we always like to look ahead. Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about what you're working on next for our subscribers and readers?
Sure. So some of the things that I am making phone calls about and looking into are cell and gene therapies. And I also am interested in looking at a new Medicare prior authorization model in traditional Medicare.
And Dr. Califf, what are you focused on next in your work?
Oh boy, you bring out the antibodies in me when you even mention prior authorization. Oh my God, what a mess. So I hope that the new program works. I'm a little concerned about things I've heard, but that's be that as it may. I do want to mention the user fees. You asked, what might come to light. The answer is just about everything. I mean, the user fee is quite a social engagement. I've been involved in 2 rounds of user fees during my 2 times at FDA. And it's a chance for the industry and FDA to express their opinions, but remember that professional organizations, industry organizations, and patient groups and public health groups all also get to weigh in. And ultimately, the user fee is only enacted if Congress passes a law. So a lot of this will come up, and it's a real opportunity. As for me personally, I'm mostly working right now in the information ecosystem. I'm very concerned that while the traditional sick care system, as we call it in the US, is magnificent, if you get into it and you're covered by insurance, that is, if you get really sick, it's amazing what we can do now. Our public health system has crumbled to a large extent. And the big space, which is not being tended to in the best way, I think, is a digital space where people are getting increasing amounts of their health information through social media and other digital means. And if you go to academic medical centers, like where I've grown up, people are bewildered by this because they're used to patients making appointments to see doctors or nurse practitioners or physician's assistants. But people are making their choices every day now based on the information they're getting through social media. So having worked at Alphabet or Google for 6 years, I have a real interest in this. And I think there's an amazing opportunity to extend healthy longevity by reaching people in their homes every day and helping them sort through the amazing amounts of bogus information and things that are being sold to them that are unhealthy and don't work, but being sold as, quote, wellness, unquote, approaches. So I'm working a lot on that, but I'd say also my never-ending effort to try to make clinical trials better. It's been a problem forever. They're way too expensive. You mentioned the vaccine trials. Remember that, well, just to note it, in Scandinavia, they just reeled off a couple of 300,000 person vaccine trials at almost no cost because they used electronic health record, digital means to get consent and to give people information about the trials. And they didn't have to create this entirely separate research infrastructure. And then finally, I'm working a lot with the AI people, like everybody is. But just to give you a quick vision for the world we're headed to, imagine a world where your electronic records, not just your health records and claims data, but to the extent you want to, your measurements from wearables, but also your social data, if you want to put it into the system, will be analyzed by AI agents, which will then talk to the world's body of knowledge, which will be completely up to date in real time. There's a company called Open Evidence and a company called Up to Date. Open Evidence just jumped way ahead, and with no sales force, half of doctors are using it, including me, because it gives you all the information you need right up to date. Up to date is what we used to use. It's now developing, as I understand it, a competitive foundational model. So you have your electronic record talking to the world's knowledge, and then compiling all the electronic records, you can generate clinical trials at a low cost and get new information, new knowledge. And so the question for somebody like me is, what's the role of a clinician? And I would urge for people that haven't seen it to watch The Pit. If you want to get a really good feeling for what healthcare is really like, the streaming show The Pit. You know, most people like me don't like medical shows, but almost everyone I know who's involved in medicine, including my son, who's an emergency doc himself, would say this one really hits the mark. But the point is that we're going to enter a system where rational decision making will be at a super level that has never existed before. But most people are not rational, especially when it comes to illness in themselves or their children or people that they care about. So redefining the role of the clinician, when you don't go to a doctor because the doctor has all the knowledge will be on your cell phone. But what you need is wisdom about how do you decide what to do given all your options. So that's my short list. At age 74, it's keeping me pretty busy.
That is super fascinating and certainly something we're super interested in following. So we hope we'll have you back to talk about some of these AI issues. Thank you so much, Dr. Califf and Rebecca, for joining us. We'll be continuing to cover all these issues closely at WP Intelligence. And before we wrap, a quick reminder that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And we'll send our live audience a link to the recording of today's briefing. And please take a moment to complete the short post-briefing survey. Your feedback directly shapes what we cover next. And join us next Friday for a briefing on the oil and gas outlook for 2026 and where the administration's bold growth agenda is potentially going to run into some speed bumps. So have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next week.